it's appropriate to talk about now Julian Assange, because Julian Assange's work was kind of the antidote to this America problem, to be able to expose the lies, the war crimes, right, the deception of the Western media in such a profound way, such an impactful way, to the point where the entire mainstream media, not many people remember this, but the mainstream media had to pay attention to Assange's work deeply, right, in that early period, 2011, 12, because of just how damning the indictments were and the evidence was of U.S. war crimes. You've been working with Julian Assange, around Julian Assange's case since the beginning. And could you comment on where things are at? I know that the order was given, that extradition is on the table. I know that there's a lot of complicated legal proceedings from here. And we found out so many different things about how the CIA was spying on journalists, people, maybe perhaps yourself, as you were talking to Julian Assange, right? Just in order to keep him where he is at right now, which is imprisoned without committing any kind of crime, for what I can gather. What are your reactions to where things are at now with regard to Julian Assange, given all that we've just talked about, the dangers of this misinformation and this threat of perhaps one of the biggest, most consequential number of wars to come when it comes to Russia and China?
But Julian is terribly important. It's a hideous case of injustice, and the toll on Julian himself as the center of this injustice is just terrible. But it's also emblematic of the very thing that we've been talking about. WikiLeaks broke the silence of the media. You know, we talked at the beginning about, again, this is the perception. We have to always mention this distorted perception that comes from media. Well, WikiLeaks broke through that. Yes, as you say in the beginning, the media, the so-called mainstream, took a great deal of notice of him. His revelations could not be ignored. They were extraordinary. They were, if you like to use the old saying, they were 100 scoops rolled into one. They were telling people what they had a right to know, and they were describing in graphic, authentic detail. That's the point about them. They were authentic. Chelsea Manning's revelations gave us a glimpse of war that I knew about, the 360-degree principle. That is, you kill everything within 360 degrees, regardless of whether it's military or civilian. That principle, so-called principle, has existed since Vietnam. And there it was in Iraq being applied at the time of when the collateral murder video was made, showing an US Apache helicopter shooting down people in the street in Baghdad. America's colonial wars have always been homicidal. They've been an extension of a homicidal culture that exists in the United States itself, as we know, week after week, with yet another mass killing. Well, that is simply transferred. It was certainly so in Vietnam. The body count, killing people, whoever they were, was what mattered. Not even winning the thing, killing people. So Julian Assange's WikiLeaks pushed back the screen and presented the truth of this to millions of people. It couldn't be ignored. It was published all over The Guardian in London, most of it in the New York Times, other newspapers all over the world, it was a revelation, followed, and both from Iraq and Afghanistan, followed by the leaking of diplomatic cables that showed how these so-called diplomats think and plan our destinies. It was an extraordinary public service by WikiLeaks. At the same time, of course, it shamed the media because the media had not done anything like this. And so we had the spectacle of, say, papers like The Guardian turning on Assange. And you must remember that they conducted pretty well a decade-long, lots of them did, including the New York Times and other papers, Washington Post, decade-long campaign of vitriol against Assange, mocking the very idea that he was a truth teller, a journalist, and to the point now they are very quiet because it's quite obvious that everything Assange predicted has come true. Even the prediction, possible prediction, that what has happened to him could certainly happen to others. I don't think it'll happen to the New York Times or the Guardian, but it will happen to those journalists who do their job and do something of what he has done. So everything that happens to Julian Assange could not be more important for journalism. That's his crime, of course. He has one crime, journalism. For journalism and for the people who still depend on journalists to tell them how the world works. It is a very complicated judicial process, Danny. It's where it's at the moment. Yes, the Home Secretary here, who's like the Interior Minister, has given the order for him to be extradited in the United States. Now, if he goes to the United States, he'll be dropped in a maximum security hellhole. He'll have a trial in Virginia, where his grand juries and juries will be made up of government employees and particularly drawn from the security establishment, so he doesn't stand a chance. And the so-called charges, which are under a 1917 legislation called the Espionage Act, add up to him getting 175 years, all for journalism. It's grotesque, absurd, but it's hard to laugh at something like this. It's really grotesque. So keeping him out of the United States has been an aim of the campaign of his lawyers here. Very difficult because all governments allied, so-called, with the United States or in league with the United States have colluded with them, including the government of Julian's own country, Australia. It colluded with the United States instead of protecting its citizen. I can't think, frankly, of another injustice, another miscarriage of justice as great as this. So where we are at the moment is that the lawyers, Julian's lawyers, have submitted to the High Court their response to the Home Secretary's extradition order, which takes the case, if the High Court if the High Court accepts it. If it does, it takes it back into the High Court, and we begin the whole process again through the High Court in Britain, possibly ending up with the European Court. So who knows where it'll go? I don't know, and I'm not sure the lawyers know. No, we're holding our breath. But the one glimmer of hope is that if the lawyers are allowed to argue on the basis of truth and of what Julian actually did, which was the very antithesis of a crime, then it may be very, very difficult for the High Court to allow the United States, and inevitably another appeal, which the US will make, no doubt. I don't know. So far, the courts in this country have seemed to be an extension of the Department of Justice in Washington. So I'm not optimistic.